First, I want to thank Mina and the others within the MyData world who have really initiated an important conversation about our data and what it means to think in those terms. So today I'm going to make my own case for moving from individual and collective, and I'll share some examples of how I think we can do that. These examples are based on my own research. I'm not giving you an institutional view, right? This is a view from a research point of view. So I'm going to argue that our data matters for a particular reason. And it matters, I think, because it's really communities and groups where we find meaning in data at all, right? Where we sort of establish what the value is in the first place. And we can do that in a community-based way, or we can do that in a corporate setting. But either way, that's where it's going to happen. And so, in a sense, this is something that companies already know, right? They already have their collectivities, and those collectivities organize the work of data, right? That's where the work of aggregation, of data exploration, of normalization and modeling, and all of that stuff, right, gets organized in some way, right, and named and articulated as something we've got to do. Right, so if they've got their notion of our data, right, if we don't, include the work of data in our own notion of our data, we have a real risk, and that risk is to cede meaning-making, right, to those institutions, right, to sort of let them define what data's about in the first place. So how do we change who gets to look at the aggregate? And why do they look? It turns out that that's a really hard problem because you can't just foist onto the public a large complex data set and expect them to do anything about it, right? But I think what we can do is we can start to change the conditions that make it possible to work with data. And I think of those conditions in kind of two layers. One is the technical means of production, and the other is the social means of production. So, at a technical level, right, we've got to start with a lot of the technologies that we've already been thinking about and working on, particularly data portability, right? But then add in new capabilities, right? Things like being able to re-aggregate data across people with the right permissioning, which is something that Matt Baller, next speaker, will talk a little bit more about. Open Humans does a really interesting job of this. We also need tools that help mere mortals parse data, right? Those of us who aren't data scientists. And also to give back, to figure out how to give back data, not just sort of raw as collected data, but parsings, visualizations, things that start to have value, right? How do we actually do that? I have an experimental tool, a prototype really called DataSense that sort of works in that space. But for this talk, I'm really going to focus on the social means of production. And here I put that in kind of two subcamps. One is the cultural innovation. And by cultural innovation, I really mean finding ways to build up the cultural capacity to think with data. Now, to my mind, that's actually really different. That's not STEM education, that's not learning statistics, it's certainly not learning to code, right? It's the ability to really sort of have good instincts, right? It's the development of good instincts about what kinds of problems data can help with and what kinds of problems data can't help with, right? So it's about the ability to say, there's there's a shared problem, a public health problem, environment, whatever it is, and sort of be able to say, okay, well, if we measured it in such and such a way, and that means we've got to set up such and such an infrastructure, then we'll get, so this out of it, we'll be able to take this action, right? So those steps are not trivial, right? That's actually a learned skill, and it's a skill that takes an imagination about about what the steps are, right? You have to know that, okay, a sensor network has got to be set up in a certain way, that the data rate might have to go a certain way, and somebody's got to deal with the parsing, right? You don't have to do all of those things, but you got to know that it has to be done, right? So I think we can get creative about how we kind of get people to that place. Now, I also think there's a kind of in the social arena, there's also, you could call it a kind of institutional innovation that's necessary. And here I mean changes to the social structures. Oh, I even forgot about my slides. Look at that. I have some, really. What I mean by institutional innovation, right, is this change to the social structures that support data work. So my example of this will come out of the Quantified Self community, where I've spent many years. And in the Quantified Self community, these are people who are already making good use of personal data, right? They've been demanding their own data back for many years, well before GDPR. And they're often doing it for some health reason. And so what they do is they get together and they exchange ideas about what setup is good for what problem, and what kind of parsing do you want to use for what sort of situation, right? And on it goes, right? So they're exchanging ideas. And so that work really is in the public interest. As I think you'll hear about later, they're actually making really interesting headway in arenas where clinical medicine kind of, leaves important questions on the table. But they do it all as unpaid labor. So these are folks working on, weekends and the evenings, and so, there's nothing wrong with volunteering, but there is something wrong with relying on volunteers, right? Because we're sort of building up this body of knowledge about the problems of well-positioned people who have the economic capacity to do something about it, right? We're not hearing from the folks who are working, 2 jobs at poverty wages while trying to parent, right? And that's a real problem. The other issue, besides the resourcing issue, has to do with what you could call organizational design or institutional design. And what I mean by this is that we've got to think about how to design the right occasions or the right sort of social context in which to do this data work. So when I was testing this software called DataSense, one of the things I learned was we'd built it for individual use, for individual quantified self folks to find their, what's going on with their own data. And it turns out that people really don't want to work with data alone. And even those that do tend to do it behind the scenes in order to kind of meet some sort of social obligation, right? Like to bring it to an event. So these occasions, these events aren't necessarily really well defined yet, right? We have a notion of the hackathon that gets us so far. We have the notion of the quantified self meeting, which I absolutely love, but only gets us so far too. So I think we need a lot more innovation, a lot more creativity put towards this question of what is it that we're asking people to participate in at all. So now I'm going to turn to an example of an Our Data project in action. And I'm not going to claim that this project made some massive social impact, but I will claim that it did at least make an attempt at bringing together the social and the technical in new ways. And it turns out once you try to do that, you learn some things the hard way. and so I think these lessons were worth sharing if you're going to go down this path, because there were definitely surprises. So this is a sub-project of the project I'm showing you here. It's called Real-Time Health Monitoring. And it was a collaboration between a university and a series of community groups for people who live next to oil refineries. Now, you can imagine if you live next to an oil refinery, you really want to know what's in the air. And this was a set of groups really that fought really hard to get air monitors installed in the first place, right? The high quality kind. Right, so that was a fight, right, in and of itself, to get air monitoring at all. This was in the US, you can imagine. why there was such a fight. So what was interesting is that even though they had worked so hard to get data, actually that data wasn't being used by anyone in the system. And there were a variety of reasons for that, but one certainly was that actually it wasn't speaking to the question that people had, which is are these pollutants affecting our health, right? How are we being impacted? And so to do that, you actually need more data, and you need different data. So we worked together to create this participatory project where folks were equipped with some wearables, and we did some heart rate and blood oxygen monitoring and a whole bunch of other stuff that didn't pan out, in order to try to sort of establish, what is the kind of the relationship in time, right, time series correlations between air quality and cardiovascular and pulmonary health. So already we had gotten beyond the individual and had established some sense of a kind of an institutional or organizational design, right? We had some. We weren't treating these people as atomistic individuals, and we had a common purpose. And that common purpose, in turn, gave us the context in which to set up those occasions where we sat down together to look at data. It certainly took some doing to figure out what that would look like and how you would look at complex data sets with someone. But we got there, and we had some new tools as well, right? So I got involved in this at all because I wanted to know if data sense made sense for these groups, right? For people who have a clear understanding that sort of a clear need for data, but not necessarily the technical skills to kind of just do it on their own, right? So my test for this was, if somebody who doesn't code aggregate data across multiple different sources and put it in the same visual or computational frame? And the answer, after a lot of bug fixes, was yes. Debugging was extraordinary. In any case, we had some tools to work with that we didn't before, and that did, in fact, make a difference. So these components that I've been calling for were there, and then there were some lessons that came about by putting them together. The first one was that it turns out that being community-driven doesn't mean that you can just do away with the experts entirely. So when we first set up the project, we were fairly determined to do it in what at the time I called a quantified self way. You could also think of this as doing it in the MyData way, meaning that participants were the ones who had control over the data. We were very clear about not making ownership claims of it, either my company or the university. I realize we have now had a robust debate about what ownership means, but nevertheless, that was the framing, so bear with me. Right, so folks could do what they liked with it. They could send it on to somebody else. They could get their own favorite analyst, do work themselves, and I thought naively that I would only help when folks got stuck. Now, it turned out that instead what you really need in a situation like this is an actual person, a human, who can put options on the table for folks really from beginning to end, right? Someone who can sort of say, look, if we're gonna do this, here are our options for sensing, right? Here are some tools that would work for this purpose, but have constraints in this way, right? Here's the data you're gonna collect, and it's gonna be, you're gonna get some signal, but not other signals, right? All the way through to the parsing, which is, not just the math, but also questions like, well, if we're doing a time series aggregation, are we talking about, a bodily response to pollution on the minute or on the day, right? You need an aggregation function, which means you need to know what an aggregation function is. But having somebody there to put those options on the table, right, and in dialogue, that's what matters, and that's actually pretty hard to do. So the second lesson is the opposite of the first. It's also the corollary in some sense, which is that if you take the experts too seriously, you're also not going to get very far. So we had been doing some due diligence before we started the project, and really we discovered that there's no shortage of public health researchers who really can only conceive of a world in which it's the researcher who owns both the data and the interpretation, right? Where professional research has complete control over that. And in turn, these were folks who were very preoccupied with this problem of, well, if people have access to the raw data and they don't look at it in the way that I want them to look at it, they might start to worry about their health. Right? It was just like crazy, right? These are people who live next to oil refineries, right? They each know somebody who's dead from thyroid cancer, right? You can't tell me that these are not people who understand risk, right? So this is just completely, to my mind, it's paternalistic. What I chose to take from it was, this idea that you do have to sort of, if you're going to, particularly if you're part of the organizing crew, you've got to be very clear about what people do and don't assume about risk. But it speaks to this broader point, which is, in an our data world, right, where folks are doing more of this stuff, it becomes really important to learn how to discern between what's the good advice that others have learned through years of experience, and what's really an indication of people who are trying to just gatekeep who gets to know what. And there's a very fine line between those. So this third lesson is something that I'm absolutely obsessed with as an anthropologist, which is, if you're going to go down this road, expect that people know both more than you think they know and less than you think they know, both at the same time, right? So I'm trying to encourage you to forget the notion of data literacy that kind of starts with the beginner and ends with the expert, and as if it's a kind of a nice continuum that we sort of, like school, right? You take the advanced courses. Life does not work that way. And I'll give you an example of this. In the course of this work, I spent a lot of time sitting down with folks and looking at their data. And by their data, I mean something of some level of complexity. So we're talking, once a minute sample rate across 15 parameters for about 2 months, right? So that's a reasonable chunk, right? And what I found was that these were people who really know a whole lot about air quality data. They can tell you what a detection limit is in an air quality sensor. They can tell you about how different sensor architectures, in fact, have a profound effect on the kinds of numbers they produce, right? They can also tell you a lot about data smoothing and why you don't want to do it. In the US, the regulations are such that they're often averages across a time period. So for, say, benzene, the regulators deem it safe if benzene is below a certain threshold for 24 hours, right? Anything above that's a violation. And so what the locals will say is, you can have a regulation about the average running temperature of water for 24 hours, but if you're running cold water and then you run boiling water for 2 minutes, you're still going to get burned, right? So they have a very clear idea about why, in fact, you do need the granular data and not smooth data. Now, when we then sat down and looked at some heart rate data, which has lots and lots of fluctuation, and so you do want to smooth that out to get an underlying sort of trend line, to be able to look at it in the context of that benzene, say, there was a lot of kind of, wait, what are you doing? What is this thing? Okay, well, and it was because there was this other notion of averaging that was kind of bad, right? Like not something you want to do. And so that took dialogue, and it took time, but eventually we did get there, right? We did get to a kind of a facility where people were saying, okay, well, let's bring that smoothing thing back. Okay, no, take it away again. All right, let's grab the highs, right? And so we could start to have that conversation, but we had to have it together. which is a real difficulty, actually, if what you're trying to do is, if you're trying to build a tool or you're trying to build a program, right? When you're first starting out, you've got to make assumptions about what people do and don't know, right? That's just kind of the way it is. But just be prepared to kind of undo those very quickly, because there is a mutual learning process that's actually the more important piece. So this last lesson is that something really wonderful happens when the individual person can start to see themselves in the context of the group. So when we were assembling the pilot phase for this study, I noticed actually a pretty significant constraint in my software. So as I said earlier, we had designed it for individual self-tracker use. We knew self-trackers worked in a community and exchanged things, and so we followed what they exchanged, right? So they exchanged, in my system, you can exchange data, send it off to somebody else. You can exchange visualizations. You can say, oh, look, I found this. Here you go. You can exchange sort of mini processing pipelines, right? I filtered this and joined that and reaggregated in this way, cut out the data, you do it on yours, right? So we thought we had a notion of the social. It turns out the notion that we didn't have was to aggregate across a population, right? So I couldn't actually, in the end, do a kind of an average correlation between heart rate and benzene or whatever it was. And so, so that's a constraint. What we did have instead was what we called the correlation grid, which will make your eyeballs hurt for a second. I'm going to show it to you, but bear with me. What it's designed to do is to take in a handful of data and make pairwise correlations, right? So A correlates with B correlates with C, A also correlates with C. And the way you got to read it, I'm going to show it to you. The way you got to read it is it's like a distance map. Remember those old-fashioned distance grids, right? So I'll show it to you now. Right, so the top part of the graph is the same as the bottom part. It's just expressed in two different ways, right? So the scatter plots correlate to, are the exact same thing as the correlation coefficients on the bottom. Right, so we made a little hack, right? So everyone sent from their accounts into my account their heart rate data or whatever else it was. And then I kind of produced these things where I loaded all of the heart rates in, and you can start to, and then I paired it with one substance at a time. And so you can look down the side and see, oh, okay, directionally, folks are correlating in this way, roughly, right? You can also see that people's heart rates correlate. It turns out that if you all sleep at the same time, you're going to get a correlation. It's mildly interesting. So I showed these grids to participants, right? Because that's what I had. And something kind of miraculous occurred, which is people started asking these interesting questions, really, really, really smart questions. Well, because they can see the variety, right? So they're like, well, is that so-and-so? Well, actually, she lives really close to the refinery. Or, oh, so-and-so, is of a certain age and has all these health problems. Or, oh, actually, you know what? I didn't tell you that I was out of the area for a week. So maybe my correlation is actually a little bit different than what's being shown here, right? So you had this kind of power, right? It's a power to literally see yourself here, which makes things quite visceral. But also the power to kind of bring in your own knowledge in a kind of a social way, right? To sort of, to work through together what's the real context here, which I would argue is actually much more powerful than having a data scientist make guesses at it. Right, so, what I could have done, what I probably should have done if I had thought harder about it, was to sort of collapse all this and say, the group correlates, with this pollutant, but not that. But I didn't do that, which would have been better from a science communication perspective, right? This is a kind of an eyeful to look at. But I don't think I would have gotten the same kind of questions and the same kind of engagement as if we did. So wrapping up then, I call this approach a kind of an N of many ones approach. And what I mean by that is an approach that tries to visually, computationally, and socially enable people to see themselves in the context of others. Now, this happened to have come about in part by accident, but it was an accident that happened because we set the conditions for it to happen. Right? We didn't know what was going to happen, but what we did do was design, the capacity for something to happen. We were reworking both the social means of production and the technical means of production, both at the same time, and what that did was it dialed us into new ways of making meaning. It dialed us into a place where context started to really come alive, where we were actually really responsible to that context, where we were looking one another in the eye, which to my mind is what our data is all about. So thank you.